I fold the demand letter into my coat pocket, while Claire stands in my driveway, arms crossed like a petulant child. The morning light caught the edges of her perfect manicure as she tapped her foot against the concrete. At 28, my niece had developed the kind of entitlement that money couldn't buy, but inheritance expectations could nurture. She stood there in designer clothes I'd probably helped fund through years of birthday checks and Christmas gifts, waiting for my answer to her ultimatum. Claire had always been my sister Margaret's golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our family's eyes. When her parents died in that car accident 5 years ago, I'd stepped in without hesitation, not just as her uncle, but as her financial guardian, managing the trust fund her father had left behind. I'd watched over every penny, made sure she finished college, helped her get that marketing job downtown. The trust fund wasn't enormous by today's standards, but it was substantial enough to give her a comfortable start in life. The problem was, Claire had burned through her monthly allowance by the second week of each month for the past 3 years. Designer bags, expensive dinners, weekend trips to Miami with friends who treated her credit cards like their personal ATMs. She'd called me yesterday morning with that familiar honey-sweet voice she used when she wanted something. Could we meet at my house to discuss her future? She had some exciting plans she wanted to share with her favorite uncle. I should have known better. The sweetness in Claire's voice had always preceded some form of financial request, but this morning felt different. There was something harder in her expression, something calculating in the way she'd positioned herself between my car and the front door. She wasn't asking this time, she was demanding. The yacht she wanted wasn't just any boat. She'd done her research, printed out glossy photos of a 40-foot cabin cruiser docked in Fort Lauderdale. Price tag, $250,000, more than half of what remained in her trust fund after her recent spending sprees. She explained her reasoning with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Her friends were all buying boats, joining yacht clubs, spending their summers on the water. She was tired of being the only one without her own vessel, tired of always being the guest instead of the hostess. The trust fund was hers anyway, she reminded me, so why shouldn't she spend it on something that would bring her joy? I listened to her presentation without interrupting, watching the way she gestured toward the printed photos like a salesperson closing a deal. She'd even researched marina fees, insurance costs, maintenance schedules. In her mind, this wasn't a frivolous purchase, but a calculated investment in her social status. When she finished talking, she looked at me expectantly. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. I could see her confidence beginning to waver slightly as seconds passed without my immediate agreement. I'd spent 5 years protecting Claire's inheritance from her own impulses, explaining why certain purchases needed to wait, why building financial security mattered more than immediate gratification. I'd been patient when she'd maxed out her credit cards, understanding when she'd needed money for genuine emergencies, generous when she'd asked for help with her apartment deposit. But something about this moment felt final. Maybe it was the way she'd positioned herself in my driveway like she owned the place. Maybe it was the calculating look in her eyes as she'd presented her yacht research. Maybe it was the complete absence of any acknowledgement for the years I'd spent managing her affairs, protecting her future. She wanted an answer right now, she told me. The seller had other interested buyers, and she couldn't afford to wait while I deliberated. Her friends were planning a summer boat tour of the Keys, and she needed to secure her purchase within the week to join them. The ultimatum came, dressed in her sweetest voice, but it was an ultimatum nonetheless. Either I authorized the yacht purchase immediately, or I shouldn't expect to see her at family gatherings anymore. She had other relatives who understood the value of supporting family dreams, she mentioned casually. Relatives who wouldn't stand in the way of her happiness over money that was rightfully hers anyway. I looked at this young woman I'd helped raise, this child I'd protected and provided for, and realized I was seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. The entitlement wasn't new, but the willingness to leverage our relationship for financial gain felt like crossing a line neither of us could uncross. The morning sun cast long shadows across my driveway as I considered my response, knowing that whatever I said next would change everything between us forever. 2 weeks passed before Claire called again, and her voice carried a different tone entirely. The honey sweetness had been replaced by something sharper, more urgent. She needed to see me immediately, she said. There had been some kind of mistake with her trust fund access, some banking error that was preventing her from making the yacht purchase. I agreed to meet her at my office downtown, the same office where I'd spent countless hours over the past 5 years managing her financial affairs. She arrived 15 minutes late, rushing in with the kind of breathless energy that suggested she'd been arguing with someone else before our appointment. Claire had attempted to withdraw the yacht money herself the previous week. She'd marched into the bank with her identification, her copy of the trust documents, and a check made out to the boat seller. The bank manager had been polite but firm. She couldn't access those funds without my co-signature as the trustee. She'd tried 3 different branches of the same bank, convinced that someone hadn't understood the paperwork correctly. Each time, the answer had been the same. The trust required my approval for any withdrawal over $10,000. This wasn't a banking error or a bureaucratic mistake. This was how her father had structured the inheritance. I watched her pace around my office, gesturing at the walls, like they were personally responsible for her frustration. She'd already put down a deposit on the yacht using her credit card, she explained. The seller was expecting the remaining balance by Friday, or she'd lose both the boat and her deposit money. Her friends had found a different marina, one with better amenities and closer proximity to the restaurants they frequented. The summer boat tour plans had been finalized, and she was the only one in their group still without her own vessel. Did I understand how embarrassing this was for her? I let her talk until she exhausted herself, until the pacing slowed and she finally sat down across from my desk. The afternoon light streaming through my office windows seemed to highlight the fine lines around her eyes, stress marks that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. She tried a different approach then, one that felt more familiar. She apologized for her ultimatum, called it a moment of frustration that didn't represent her true feelings. I was still her favorite uncle, the only family member who truly understood her dreams and aspirations. But even her apology felt calculated, rehearsed in the way someone practices a presentation before an important meeting. She needed my signature on the withdrawal authorization, and she was willing to say whatever words might convince me to provide it. I opened the trust file I'd been maintaining since her parents' death, the thick folder containing 5 years of careful financial management. Investment statements, expense reports, educational payments, emergency withdrawals. Every transaction documented and justified, every decision made with her long-term security in mind. Claire leaned forward as I flipped through the pages, perhaps hoping to see something that might support her case. Instead, I showed her the pattern of her own spending over the past 3 years. The monthly allowance increases she'd requested and received, the credit card debts I'd helped her pay down, the vacation expenses that had depleted her discretionary fund. She studied the numbers with growing discomfort, perhaps seeing her financial behavior quantified for the first time. Her monthly spending had increased by 40% each year, while her income from the marketing job had remained essentially flat. The yacht purchase wouldn't just be expensive in the short term. Marina fees, insurance, maintenance, fuel costs, the ongoing expenses would consume nearly all of her remaining monthly allowance. She'd be boat-rich and cash-poor, dependent on credit cards for basic living expenses. Claire listened to my explanation with the kind of forced patience that suggested she was waiting for me to finish talking rather than actually considering my words. When I closed the file, she asked the only question that mattered to her: would I sign the authorization or not? The silence in my office felt heavy with years of accumulated expectations and disappointments. Through the window, I could see people walking to their cars in the parking lot below, ordinary people ending their workday and heading home to ordinary problems. I realized that nothing I said would change Claire's mind about the yacht, just as nothing she said would change my mind about protecting her financial future. Friday afternoon brought the phone call I'd been expecting but dreading. Claire's voice cracked slightly as she explained that she'd lost the yacht deposit. The seller had found another buyer, someone who could provide immediate payment without requiring trustee approvals or family negotiations. Her $1,000 deposit had been forfeited according to the purchase contract she'd signed. She blamed me for the loss, of course. If I'd simply signed the authorization when she'd first asked, she'd already be a boat owner planning her summer adventures. Instead, she was out $1,000 with nothing to show for her efforts except embarrassment in front of her friends. I listened to her frustration without offering comfort or advice. Sometimes the most expensive lessons were the most valuable ones, though I suspected Claire wasn't ready to appreciate that perspective yet. But her call wasn't just about venting her disappointment. She'd found another boat, she told me. Not quite as nice as the first one, but available for immediate purchase at a slightly lower price. $200,000 for a 38-foot cruiser docked in Miami. She'd already driven down to see it, already negotiated with the owner. This seller was more flexible about timing, willing to hold the boat for 2 weeks while she secured financing. All she needed was my signature on a different withdrawal authorization, this one for a slightly smaller amount. Claire had learned nothing from losing her deposit, except how to find a different boat. I told her I needed time to consider her request, knowing that my answer would be the same regardless of how much time passed. She interpreted my hesitation as negotiation, launching into a detailed explanation of why this second boat was actually a better choice than the first. The marina was closer to her apartment, she explained. The maintenance history was more complete. The previous owner had already handled most of the paperwork for transferring the slip rental. She made it sound like she was doing me a favor by finding a more reasonable option. After we hung up, I sat in my office for another hour, watching the sun set behind the downtown buildings. 5 years of managing Claire's trust fund had taught me that her financial desires would always expand to exceed whatever resources were available. The yacht wasn't really about boats or summer adventures or keeping up with friends. It was about the feeling of having unlimited access to money that didn't require work or sacrifice to obtain. The specific purchase was less important than the principle of getting what she wanted when she wanted it. I'd been enabling that mindset by consistently saying yes to smaller requests, by finding compromises that satisfied her immediate desires while protecting her long-term interests. But compromise had taught Claire that persistence was more effective than responsibility. That evening, I drafted a letter to the bank, formally declining authorization for any boat purchase. I also scheduled a meeting with the family attorney who'd helped establish Claire's trust fund. If she was determined to access her inheritance for frivolous purchases, she needed to understand the legal process for challenging my trustee authority. The attorney explained that Claire could petition the court to remove me as trustee if she could demonstrate that I was acting against her interests, but the burden of proof would be substantial, requiring evidence that my financial management had been negligent or self-serving. Claire's spending patterns and my detailed documentation would likely support my position as the responsible party. Courts generally favored trustees who prioritized long-term security over short-term gratification. Still, legal challenges were expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved. The attorney suggested I prepare for the possibility that Claire might pursue that option rather than accept my continued oversight of her inheritance. As I drove home that night, I wondered if I'd failed Claire by being too protective or if I'd failed her by not being protective enough when it mattered most. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the kind of official weight that suggested serious intentions. Claire had retained her own attorney, a family law specialist who'd filed a formal petition to remove me as trustee of her inheritance. The legal documents were thorough and professionally prepared, arguing that my excessive financial conservatism was preventing her from accessing funds that were rightfully hers. I read through the petition carefully, noting the specific language her lawyer had chosen. They weren't alleging fraud or embezzlement, which would have been difficult to prove given my meticulous record-keeping. Instead, they were arguing philosophical differences about financial management and age-appropriate independence. Claire was 28 years old, the petition stated. She had a college degree, steady employment, and the legal right to make her own financial decisions. My refusal to authorize reasonable expenditures from her own trust fund constituted an abuse of my trustee authority. The yacht purchase was characterized as a reasonable investment in recreational assets rather than a frivolous expense. They'd even included comparable sales data for similar boats, arguing that marine vessels held their value better than many other luxury purchases. More interesting was the section about family relationships. Claire's attorney had documented my pattern of financial control that extended beyond prudent money management into personal manipulation. By threatening to withhold trust funds, they argued, I was coercing her into maintaining a relationship she might otherwise choose to end. I had to admire the strategic thinking behind that argument. If Claire could demonstrate that I was using the trust fund to control her personal choices, she might have grounds for requesting a different trustee rather than simply challenging my specific decisions. The petition requested an immediate hearing to review my trustee performance and potentially transfer authority to a neutral third party. Claire's attorney had suggested several professional trust management companies that could provide objective financial oversight without the complications of family dynamics. I called my own attorney that afternoon, a man who'd been handling my legal affairs for over a decade. He read through Claire's petition with the kind of careful attention that expensive legal advice required, occasionally making notes in the margins. His initial assessment was cautiously optimistic. Claire's case wasn't frivolous, but it wasn't particularly strong either. Courts were reluctant to remove trustees without clear evidence of misconduct, and my documentation would likely demonstrate competent financial management. However, he warned me that family disputes often became more complicated than the original legal issues. Claire's attorney might expand their arguments to include other aspects of my trustee decisions, potentially forcing me to justify 5 years of financial choices in exhaustive detail. The legal process would also be public record, which meant our family's financial affairs would become accessible to anyone interested enough to review the court documents. Claire might not have considered how that publicity could affect her own professional reputation. We scheduled a meeting for the following week to begin preparing my response to her petition. In the meantime, I was instructed to continue managing the trust fund exactly as I had been, avoiding any changes that might be interpreted as retaliatory. That evening, I found myself thinking about Claire's parents and wondering what they would have wanted in this situation. They'd chosen me as trustee because they trusted my judgment, but they'd also wanted their daughter to have financial security and independence. Perhaps they'd never imagined a scenario where those two goals might conflict so directly. The house felt unusually quiet that night, as if even the familiar sounds were waiting to see how this family drama would resolve itself. Claire's confidence grew noticeably over the following weeks, and she made sure I knew about her legal preparations. She called me twice, ostensibly to discuss routine trust fund matters, but really to let me know how well her case was developing. Her attorney was very optimistic, she mentioned casually. They'd found several precedent cases where courts had removed overly restrictive trustees in favor of more flexible financial management. She'd also been gathering character references from friends and colleagues, people who could testify about her responsible decision-making and mature judgment. Her employer had apparently offered to provide documentation of her steady work performance and professional growth. Most significantly, she'd found a professional trust management company willing to take over her account. They specialized in serving young adults who'd inherited family money, and they understood the importance of balancing protection with independence. Claire described their approach as much more reasonable than mine. They would review each major expenditure request on its own merits, considering factors like fair market value, personal enjoyment, and potential investment return. A yacht purchase would be evaluated just like any other significant asset acquisition. She was particularly pleased that the trust company had already performed a preliminary review of her yacht proposal. They'd concluded that a recreational vessel in the $200,000 range was a reasonable purchase for someone with her level of assets and income. I listened to these updates without commenting much, letting Claire believe that her legal strategy was working exactly as she'd planned. She interpreted my silence as worry about my own position, satisfaction that she'd finally found a way to get what she wanted despite my objections. But her calls revealed more than she probably intended. The legal fees were adding up quickly, and she'd had to take a cash advance against her credit card to cover the initial attorney retainer. The professional trust company would also charge annual fees that were significantly higher than the minimal costs of my family management. Claire was spending money she didn't have to gain access to money she wanted to spend on something she didn't need. The irony was lost on her, but it wasn't lost on me. My own attorney had been busy as well, though I'd shared less information about our preparations. He'd reviewed Claire's character references and found them predictably superficial. Friends praising her generosity and social skills, colleagues noting her punctuality and teamwork abilities. None of her references addressed the specific issue of financial responsibility, because none of them had detailed knowledge of her spending patterns or debt management. They were testifying about the Claire they knew socially, not the Claire who consistently overspent her monthly allowance. We'd also researched the trust company Claire wanted to hire. They were legitimate and properly licensed, but their client reviews revealed a pattern of permissive management that prioritized customer satisfaction over long-term financial planning. Several former clients had exhausted their inherited assets within a few years of switching to their services. The legal hearing was scheduled for the following month, giving both sides time to prepare their final arguments. Claire seemed to view this as a formality before getting access to her yacht money. She'd already contacted the Miami boat seller again, explaining that her legal issues would be resolved soon. I spent those weeks organizing 5 years of meticulous financial records, preparing to demonstrate exactly how I'd protected and grown Claire's inheritance despite her increasingly expensive lifestyle. The documents told a story that Claire's petition conveniently ignored. A young woman whose spending had consistently exceeded her income, whose debt had been repeatedly paid down using trust fund assets, whose financial security depended entirely on the inheritance her parents had left behind. But I also prepared myself for the possibility that the court might decide in Claire's favor anyway, prioritizing her legal right to control her own money over my concerns about how she would use it. The courtroom felt smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic legal setting I'd imagined. Claire sat beside her attorney at one table, dressed in a conservative business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She'd pulled her hair back severely and wore minimal makeup, clearly trying to project an image of mature responsibility for the judge. I sat at the opposite table with my attorney, surrounded by boxes of financial documents that represented 5 years of careful trust management. Every expenditure, every investment decision, every conversation about money that Claire and I had shared was documented somewhere in those files. The judge was a woman in her 50s who'd apparently handled numerous family trust disputes over her career. She began by explaining that the court's primary concern was determining whether my trustee performance had been competent and appropriate, not whether Claire's specific purchase requests were reasonable. Claire's attorney presented their case first, arguing that I'd exceeded my authority by imposing personal judgments about lifestyle choices rather than focusing on objective financial criteria. The yacht purchase was reasonable given Claire's asset level, they argued, and my refusal was based on outdated attitudes about young people and money. They presented testimony from the professional trust company about their more flexible management approach, emphasizing their experience with inherited wealth and their understanding of modern investment strategies. A recreational boat could appreciate in value, they noted, especially if properly maintained and strategically upgraded. Claire herself took the stand briefly, speaking clearly about her desire for financial independence and her frustration with what she characterized as micromanagement of her personal choices. She was careful not to directly criticize me as a person, instead focusing on the structural problems with family members serving as trustees. When my attorney presented our defense, the focus shifted to the numbers. We walked through Claire's spending patterns year by year, documenting the steady increase in her monthly expenses and the corresponding decrease in her discretionary savings. The credit card debt was particularly damaging to her case. Despite having access to a substantial trust fund allowance, Claire had consistently spent beyond her means and required bailouts from the principal balance. Her debt-to-income ratio would have disqualified her for most conventional loans. My attorney also highlighted the ongoing costs associated with boat ownership that Claire hadn't included in her purchase proposal. Marina fees, insurance, maintenance, fuel and equipment would consume nearly her entire remaining monthly allowance, leaving no buffer for emergencies or unexpected expenses. Most importantly, we demonstrated that my conservative management had actually grown the trust fund balance, despite Claire's increasing withdrawal requests. Professional investment oversight and careful spending limits had protected her long-term financial security, while still providing generous monthly support. The judge asked pointed questions about both perspectives. She wanted to understand why Claire felt unable to discuss major purchases with me before making unilateral demands. She also wanted to know whether I'd ever considered gradually increasing Claire's financial independence as she demonstrated improved money management skills. Neither of us had particularly good answers to those questions. Claire admitted that she'd never tried to negotiate or compromise on the yacht purchase, jumping straight to legal action when I didn't immediately agree. I acknowledged that I'd perhaps been too focused on protecting her assets to consider whether some expensive mistakes might be valuable learning experiences. After hearing all the testimony and reviewing the financial documents, the judge announced that she needed time to consider her decision. We would reconvene in 1 week for her ruling on whether to maintain my trustee authority or transfer it to Claire's preferred trust company. As we left the courtroom, Claire avoided eye contact with me entirely. Her attorney seemed confident but not triumphant, which suggested they weren't certain about the outcome either. I drove home wondering whether I'd done the right thing by fighting her petition so aggressively, or whether I should have simply resigned as trustee and let Claire learn expensive lessons on her own terms. The judge's decision was more nuanced than either Claire or I had anticipated. She would not remove me as trustee, finding that my financial management had been competent and that Claire's spending patterns supported my conservative approach. However, she was requiring mediation between us to establish clearer guidelines for major purchase requests and to address the communication problems that had led to this legal dispute. Claire looked stunned when the ruling was announced. She'd been so confident in her legal strategy that the possibility of losing hadn't seemed real to her. Her attorney quickly requested permission to appeal, but the judge noted that appeals were rarely successful in trustee disputes unless new evidence of misconduct emerged. The mediation order meant we'd have to work with a court-appointed mediator to develop specific criteria for evaluating future expenditure requests. The process would be binding on both of us, creating clear expectations about what kinds of purchases required my approval and what kinds Claire could make independently. I felt relieved by the outcome, but not particularly victorious. The judge had essentially confirmed that I'd been doing my job properly, but she'd also made it clear that my communication with Claire needed improvement. The mediation requirement suggested that both of us bore some responsibility for letting our disagreement escalate to legal action. Claire's legal fees had been substantial, and the court ruled that those costs couldn't be reimbursed from the trust fund since her petition had been unsuccessful. She'd spent several $1,000s of her own money to challenge my authority and had nothing to show for it except additional debt. The yacht purchase was explicitly addressed in the judge's remarks. She noted that recreational vehicles generally didn't qualify as reasonable investments for someone with Claire's spending history and debt obligations. While the purchase might not be inherently irresponsible, it wasn't appropriate given the trust fund's purpose and Claire's financial patterns. Over the following weeks, the mediation process forced both of us to articulate our expectations more clearly than we ever had during our informal family discussions. Claire had to acknowledge that her spending had been problematic and that some oversight was necessary to protect her long-term security. I had to accept that Claire was entitled to make some expensive mistakes as part of learning adult financial responsibility. The mediated agreement established specific dollar amounts she could spend without my approval, while requiring consultation for larger purchases that would affect her principal balance. The yacht purchase specifically was postponed for at least 2 years, during which time Claire would need to demonstrate improved debt management and increased savings. If she could pay down her credit cards and build an emergency fund, we would reconsider recreational purchases at that time. Claire agreed to these terms reluctantly, but she seemed to understand that legal action hadn't achieved what she'd hoped. The professional trust company she'd wanted to hire had already moved on to other clients, apparently less interested in her account once the legal complications became apparent. More significantly, the court proceedings had become part of the public record. Claire's co-workers and friends could potentially access detailed information about her spending habits, debt levels, and family financial disputes if they were curious enough to search. That public exposure seemed to bother her more than losing the legal case itself. She'd spent so much energy presenting herself as financially independent and responsible that having her actual money management scrutinized in court felt like a personal humiliation. But the mediation process also revealed something I hadn't fully understood before. Claire's desire for the yacht wasn't really about boats or status symbols. It was about feeling like a full adult who could make significant decisions without asking permission from a family member. The trust structure had inadvertently kept her in a childlike relationship with money, where someone else always had veto power over her choices. 6 months after the court ruling, Claire called to tell me she'd been promoted at work. Her voice carried a different quality than I'd heard in recent years, quieter confidence instead of demanding urgency. The promotion came with a salary increase that would help her address the debt issues the mediation had highlighted. She'd been working with a financial counselor, someone recommended by the court mediator, who specialized in helping young adults develop better money management skills. The sessions were apparently helping her understand the connection between her emotional spending and her underlying financial anxiety. Claire had also started a side business selling handmade jewelry online, something she'd mentioned years ago, but never pursued seriously. The extra income was modest, but growing, and she seemed genuinely proud of building something independent of both her job and her trust fund. Most surprisingly, she wanted to discuss modifying her trust fund allowance. Instead of receiving a fixed monthly amount, she proposed shifting to a quarterly distribution system that would require her to budget more carefully and plan ahead for larger expenses. The jewelry business had taught her about cash flow management, she explained. Having to order supplies, manage inventory, and handle seasonal sales fluctuations had given her practical experience with financial planning that her regular job hadn't provided. She'd also been reading about investment strategies and wanted to take a more active role in managing the trust fund assets. Not complete control, she clarified, but collaborative decision-making that would help her learn about long-term wealth building. I found myself genuinely impressed by these changes. The court case had apparently served as a wake-up call that motivated Claire to address her financial behaviors rather than simply fighting for unlimited access to inherited money. The yacht purchase hadn't come up in our conversation, though I suspected she was still interested in boat ownership eventually. But her approach seemed completely different now, focused on earning the purchase rather than simply demanding it. During our quarterly trust fund review that fall, Claire presented a detailed budget that included debt paydown schedules, emergency fund targets, and savings goals for specific future purchases. She'd clearly spent considerable time learning about personal finance principles. Her spending had decreased noticeably, not because she was depriving herself, but because she'd developed better habits around distinguishing between wants and needs. The impulse purchases that used to drain her checking account had been replaced by more thoughtful decisions about where her money could provide the most long-term value. Claire also apologized for the way she'd handled our disagreement about the yacht. She acknowledged that demanding immediate access to such a large sum had been unrealistic, especially given her debt situation at the time. More importantly, she thanked me for maintaining my position even when it had been difficult. She could see now that giving in to her demands would have enabled destructive financial patterns rather than helping her develop better judgment. The family relationship that had been damaged by our legal dispute was slowly healing through regular conversations about money that felt collaborative rather than adversarial. Claire seemed to genuinely value my input now that she understood I was trying to help rather than control her. As autumn turned to winter, I realized that the yacht controversy had ultimately achieved something neither of us had expected. It had forced Claire to develop the kind of financial maturity that would serve her well long after her trust fund was exhausted. The crisis had been painful for both of us, but the resolution felt more solid than any compromise we might have reached through simple negotiation. 2 years later, Claire invited me to see the boat she'd finally purchased. It wasn't the yacht she'd originally demanded, but a modest fishing boat she'd bought with money she'd saved from her jewelry business and salary increases. 23 feet long, used but well-maintained, perfect for weekend trips with friends who appreciated practical adventures over luxury statements. She'd paid cash for the purchase, avoiding boat loans and the financial pressure that monthly payments would have created. The marina slip was reasonably priced, and she'd already established relationships with other boat owners who could provide advice about maintenance and repairs. Claire seemed genuinely happy showing me around the small vessel, pointing out practical features rather than impressive amenities. She'd learned enough about boating to make informed decisions about what equipment she actually needed versus what would simply look impressive. The boat represented something far more valuable than the yacht she'd originally wanted. It was proof that she could identify a goal, develop a plan to achieve it, and execute that plan through sustained effort rather than inherited privilege. Her financial transformation had been remarkable to witness. The jewelry business had grown into a legitimate income stream that supplemented her day job. She'd paid off all her credit card debt, built an emergency fund, and even started contributing to a retirement account. More significantly, Claire had become someone who could appreciate delayed gratification and understand the relationship between effort and reward. The boat meant more to her because she'd earned it through her own work, rather than simply accessing family money. Our relationship had also evolved in ways I hadn't expected. Claire regularly asked for my advice about financial decisions, but as consultation rather than permission-seeking. She valued my experience while maintaining ultimate authority over her own choices. The trust fund was nearly depleted now, which had been the original plan. Claire's parents had intended for the inheritance to support her through young adulthood, while she developed the skills and career foundation necessary for independent living. Claire would inherit the remaining principal balance on her 30th birthday, but it would be a much smaller amount than what she'd originally expected. Her improved spending habits and successful side business made that reduction irrelevant rather than problematic. She'd also started thinking about her own eventual family and the kind of financial legacy she wanted to create. Watching her parents' money dwindle had motivated her to build wealth through earning rather than inheritance, ensuring that any children she might have would learn the value of work alongside the security of family support. As we sat on her boat watching the sunset over the marina, Claire mentioned that several of her friends were struggling with money despite having high-paying jobs or wealthy families. They'd never learned the financial discipline she'd been forced to develop through our trust fund conflicts. She credited our legal battle with teaching her lessons that formal education hadn't provided. Understanding the difference between having access to money and having control over money had been crucial for developing genuine financial confidence. Claire had also become something of a mentor to younger family members, sharing practical advice about budgeting, debt management, and career development. Her cousins sought her guidance about college choices and first jobs, recognizing that she'd successfully navigated the transition from dependence to independence. The yacht demand that had seemed so important 3 years ago now felt like ancient history, a catalyst for growth rather than a source of ongoing resentment. Claire had gotten her boat eventually, but more importantly, she'd gotten the financial maturity to truly enjoy it.